guys, this is Francesca. Welcome back to our Romance 101 series, and today I am going to be talking to you guys about mainly paranormal romance. I'm really excited about that because paranormal romance is one of my favorite romance subgenres, but I think it often and easily gets confused with other genres as well. So the first thing that I want to talk about is what is paranormal romance. So what is a paranormal romance? Basically, a paranormal romance is a story that focuses primarily on the romance. That is the main driving plot point of the story, and it features characters that either one or both of the main characters are some kind of supernatural. The world also has supernatural paranormal elements to it, but for the most part it is set in a contemporary or urban setting that is easily recognizable to us. Now, another distinction that I generally make when talking about a paranormal romance is the age of the characters. If the characters are somewhere between 13 to 18, meaning they're young adults, even though it can have a paranormal element to the story, I would still consider that book a young adult book as opposed to a paranormal. So it would be a young adult book with a paranormal romance subplot. Same goes for new adult. Obviously, within that age group, if the characters fit in that, it would be a new adult paranormal romance. So for the purposes of this video, when I'm talking about a paranormal romance, I'm talking about adult characters. But now, what's the difference between a paranormal romance and, say, a romance that has aliens or a fantasy romance? What's the difference between a paranormal romance and urban fantasy? Well, first of all, I will touch briefly on urban fantasy. Urban fantasy is not romance. While over the years, authors that write urban fantasy have included a lot of romance in their books, same as with the young adult authors, the romance is never the driving force of the story. There is a much bigger picture as to what's going on in those books. Some of them, especially recent books, if you take the romance out of the story, you're left with a really weak plot. But as a rule, an urban fantasy doesn't have to have any romance elements to it. Generally, also, a paranormal romance has an HEA for the couple that the book is about at the end of that book. There are very few paranormal romances where one love story or one HEA actually continues on for more than one book. And with an urban fantasy, the plot just continues throughout the whole series and you're following the same characters. So maybe there was a romance plot to those main characters that you were following along with, but that is developed throughout the whole series as opposed to just getting to an HEA at the end of each book. And again, this is just as a general rule. There are obviously a lot of exceptions to that, and I will talk about some of those at the end of this video. Another big one that gets a lot of people confused is fantasy romance. We all know what fantasy means, and there's fantasy in young adult stories, so a young adult fantasy. Again, I still consider that a young adult book, and the fantasy element is, to me, a secondary description or category to that story. But we know that it's set in a world that it's not our everyday life. It's not the everyday streets that we live in. And that's basically the main difference between a paranormal romance and a fantasy romance. With a fantasy romance, the word fantasy doesn't actually mean that it has paranormal characters. It doesn't have to have any paranormal or supernatural elements. It just has to be set in a world that it's made up. So to give you some examples of that, I have some recommendations, but hopefully that will help you distinguish those genres that I just talked about. First up, urban fantasy. And for that, I have the Kate Daniels series by Ilona Andrews. And I think this is a good one to talk about just because the romance element of the Kate Daniels series is important, and obviously as fans of this series were really invested in the relationship between Kate and Curran. However, that is not the main driving force of this story, and the romance between Kate and Curran develops throughout the series. All the books are about those main characters as well, so if you're following along with the series, you're not going to get to an HEA at the very beginning. So for an example of a fantasy romance, I have How to Tame a Beast in 7 Days by Carolyn Sparks. And the characters in this series can be supernatural. So they can have powers, but that's not necessarily what makes this a fantasy romance. What makes this a fantasy romance is the fact that this is set in a made-up world. The world in this series is called Earthland. There are 5 different kingdoms. A lot of the things in this world, for example, can be medieval in style. So definitely this is not about a story set in any city that you would know. And I forgot to mention that with the Kate Daniels series, which is urban fantasy, it is set in a world that we know, and in this particular case it's set in a version of Atlanta. So another one that gets confused with paranormal romance a lot, I would say, is sci-fi romance. And for that, you could really classify a book as a sci-fi romance if it has aliens, for example, like the Alien Huntress series by Gina Showalter. This is set in a world that we know, but it has characters that are not from this world. Or you can have a sci-fi romance which is exactly set in outer space, like the Phantom Corps series by Lauren Dane. Spaceships, space mercenaries, intergalactic travel, all of that would fall into a sci-fi romance instead of a paranormal romance. And then we have paranormal romance, which is what I'm basically mainly talking about today. And to identify a paranormal romance, you can easily just ask yourself the following questions. Are any of the main characters or any aspect of the world that the author has created contain paranormal elements, paranormal creatures, or magic of any type? Is it set in a modern contemporary setting, besides the fact that it has paranormal creatures or magic? Would you consider that the main couple in the story is an adult couple? And is there an HEA at the end of the book for that main couple? If you answered yes to all those questions, then it's a paranormal romance. Like, for example, the Black Dagger Brotherhood, which is about vampires and it's set in New York. Now, as always, not everything has to be black and white. There are definitely exceptions. There are definitely books that cross over multiple genres, which can make sometimes classifying a book by a genre sometimes a little bit difficult. Like, for example, the Night Huntress series by Janine Frost, and I have here the spin-off, the Night Prince series. This is primarily an urban fantasy series. However, it crosses the line into paranormal romance a little bit because of the fact that the romance is a much more important part of the story than the romance in, say, the Kate Daniels series, for example. So you will definitely find books that straddle the line between some genres, which then it just becomes, where do you think it fits the most? I still go by the definition that there is no HEA at the end of one book for the particular couple, so I still classify these as urban fantasy. Or, for example, a series like the London Steampunk series by Beck McMaster. This is primarily a steampunk series. It has all the steampunk elements that you can expect to find in a steampunk romance. However, the characters are paranormal creatures. To me, the setting becomes more important than the types of characters, so I still classify this as a steampunk romance instead of a paranormal romance, but it could fit in both. Or you could have a historical romance about paranormal creatures. Again, I always fall back on what's more important. To me, the setting is more important, so I would still classify this as a historical romance, but it could fit in both genres as well. So when books straddle the line between genres, it really is up to the reader to figure out what is the strongest element for you and which one do you think determines more of what the book should be. To me, the most important would be the age group, so that will determine whether I'm considering something a paranormal romance or urban fantasy as opposed to a young adult. After that, I would consider the setting. So if it's a modern day recognizable setting, it's a paranormal romance. If it's an outer space, it's a sci-fi romance. If it's in a made-up world, it's a fantasy romance. If it's in historical times, it's a historical romance. And last, I would say, is the type of characters. So hopefully that was a little helpful to you in determining maybe what genre you're more interested to read. Now we're going to be talking about some of the most common character types that you can find in paranormal romance. A very common character type or group would be the Band of Warriors, and I already mentioned the Black Dagger Brotherhood, also the Midnight Breed series by Lara Adrian. Basically, this is a group of paranormal creatures that are protecting their race from some kind of evil, whether it's an evil character, a prophecy, or anything like that. Next up, we have Tall, Dark, and Broody, and that is the immortal that has gone through so much in his life. He is just not happy with anything. And as an example of that, there's Lothair by Kresley Cole. You could also say this is the anti-hero type of character because these guys have done probably some pretty awful things. Next, you have the mythical warriors, and this could come in all sorts of different mythology, like for example in the Dark Warrior series by Donna Grant. You will also definitely find a lot of alpha heroes. Obviously, alphas can be found a lot in shifter romances, but that's not exclusively where you can find an alpha male. Obviously, there are also alpha male in contemporary romance, but it's definitely something you're going to find a lot of in paranormal romance. A lot of possessive males that don't want anything to come between them and their mate. Another character that is really popular is the tortured hero. And perfect example of that is Sadist from the Black Dagger Brotherhood by J.R. Ward. These are just characters that have been through a lot, and you can imagine being immortal. That could mean centuries, even thousands of years of torture. We also have the newbie, and that is usually found in a paranormal romance that puts a paranormal creature with a human who was not aware of the paranormal world. For example, I have The Protected by Shiloh Walker, in which one of the main characters, the hero of this book, is psychic. You can also find a lot of clueless heroines in paranormal romance, which may be a little too stupid to live. But you can also find a lot of kick-ass female characters in paranormal romance, like Changeling, Shifter, Mercy from Branded by Fire by Nalini Singh in the Psy-Changeling series. Now let's talk about common tropes in paranormal romance. Some would say that the Band of Warriors could be considered a trope, but we've already talked about that. You can also find a lot of fated mate stories in paranormal romance, and that is sort of the equivalent of insta-love in a way in the paranormal genre. In a fated mate story, there's something stronger that's bringing two characters together. It's not just an attraction. It's literally something from deep within them that says, this is the only person that can belong to you, period. And that is often seen in shifter romances. A lot of times they don't even have to see the person that's going to be their mate. They can smell them, they can sense them. So the attraction is instant even before actually laying eyes on that other character. Now that doesn't mean that it's insta-love and there's no tension and they don't fight it. So if it's done well, it can be a really interesting read. An example of that is the Alpha Pack series by J.D. Tyler, and here is my favorite book in that series. In this series, we have shifters with psychic powers who are in a sort of military group, so it's a little bit of romantic suspense mixed in, but I still generally consider this a paranormal romance. Another big one is the forbidden romance, and a lot of times in paranormal romance that means that it's a romance between either two types of creatures that have a long history of hating each other, like say if in that particular world vampires hate shifters. Like for example, in Slave to Sensation by Nalini Singh, we have a changeling character, which is a shifter, and a Psy character, and those two don't usually mix. So this is technically a forbidden romance. Or you just have two clans that have been at war for centuries, like in Dark Sky by Kresley Cole. You can also find romantic comedy in paranormal romance, because who's to say that paranormal romance can only be sexy or serious? There are a lot of really good and funny paranormal romances, like for example the Midnight Liaison series by Jessica Sims, which is basically about a paranormal dating service. Obviously, as with any other romance genre, you can find friends to lovers, second chance, enemies to lovers, or any mix of these tropes into one book. Like for example in Reaver by Larissa Ione, we have a second chance and enemies to lovers trope. Now, while the romance should be the main part of the story, I think the best kinds of paranormal romance are the ones that can still have a very strong world building behind their series, where the author is really clear on all the rules of how their world works and that can easily translate that to the reader. So paranormal romance can actually have a really big variety of the stories that you can have, especially because it can basically have everything that you can find in other subgenres of romance, plus some very specific things that could only be found in paranormal romance. The authors have the liberty of creating their own worlds, their own rules, which is probably why I always come back to paranormal romance as one of my favorite genres. My top 5 must-read authors in paranormal romance are Cressley Cole, J.R. Ward, Nalini Singh, Gina Showalter, and Lara Adrian. And now, for only a limited time while we're doing our introduction week to Romance 101, we are doing a blind date with a book giveaway. To enter for today's giveaway for a paranormal romance, just look in the information box down below. There will be a link that you can follow to enter. And don't forget to enter the giveaways for all the previous videos that we've already posted this week. We are giving away 1 book a day during our Romance 101 introduction series. If you have any other questions about paranormal romance, just leave them in the comments down below and I will try to do my best to answer them. Also, don't forget to tell us in the comments down below if there are any other topics that you would like us to cover in the future in our Romance 101 series. Hopefully this video was helpful to you in some way. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our videos, and follow us on all our social media. All the links are in the information box down below, as well as the blog at underthecoversbookblog.com. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and we'll see you again in the next one. Bye-bye.